and they'll pass them all around. Pleasure he gets is hobo and farm. Go tell my baby sister, don't do what I have done. In New Orleans, they call the rising sun. And the other foot on the train. I'm going back to
down, and then I will come down your way.
Judgment Day. Our love wouldn't have no right to break. To the nation, I'm going to the territory. Going to the nation, and I'm going to the territory. Tell about you, baby, every old place I go. Shining through the trees. Shining through the trees. Don't your house feel lonesome when your baby packs up to leave? I'm a stranger here. I'm a stranger everywhere. I'm a stranger here. I'm a stranger everywhere. I would go home, but I'm a stranger. My possession over Judgment Day. If I had possession over Judgment Day, my love wouldn't have no right to drink.
And then you can go on. Just hold on 1 second. Sorry. Yes. Let's say half an hour for Q&A, and my guess is it won't take that long. But if it does, I can always do the
Good evening. Good evening. Thank you. Welcome to the Bruno Walter Auditorium at the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts, the Dorothy and Lewis B. Coleman Center. My name's Jonathan Heim. I'm the curator of the American Music Collection and the Rodgers and Hammerstein Archives of Recorded Sound here at the Performing Arts Library, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all to tonight's program, Sing Out. A special welcome as well to all of those who are watching this live via the internet, via streaming technology. Tonight's program is part of our new series, Rhapsodic City, Music of New York, which covers, over the course of 6 weeks, it brings together unique films, live events that explore the city's distinct role in the formulation, emergence, and legacy of landmark musical moments of the last century, from hip-hop to punk, Prohibition-era jazz, mambo, and salsa, and the heyday of the Brill Building. The series only begins to explore the rich fabric of the musical life of New York. I encourage you to pick up a series brochure in the lobby on your way out as these events unwind through April 27th, and I draw particular attention to you to the event tomorrow night, in which we'll be screening 3 rare, possibly not really ever seen films related to this topic. That again starts at 6, it's free, we'd love to see you. This evening, we'll turn our ears and eyes to mid-century Greenwich Village, the epicenter of the folk music scene and its revival. We're so very fortunate to have with us this evening as our guide, musician and writer Elijah Wald. Elijah's formidable bibliography covers the gamut of American popular music and beyond, and includes several notable books which you can find on the table outside the lobby on your way out. If you haven't read them, I encourage you to pick them up on your way out. Notably, How the Beatles Destroyed Rock and Roll, an Alternative History of American Popular Music. Escaping the Delta, Robert Johnson and the Invention of the Blues. Narco Corrido, a journey into the music of drugs, guns, and guerrillas. Most relevant, however, for tonight's presentation is his collaboration with Dave Van Ronk on his memoir, Dave Van Ronk, Mayor of MacDougal Street, which incidentally serves as the source material for the upcoming Coen Brothers film, Inside Llewyn Davis. Before we bring him on stage, I encourage you to visit the table in the lobby. He's also asked that some of you who may have been involved in the scene maybe stick around after if there's time to help him identify some photographs. You may very well be in them. So, ladies and gentlemen, Elijah Wald.
They asked me to play some stuff as well, so I'm going to play one thing at the beginning and one thing at the end. In between, we'll hear people of the period, but this is somewhat germane. I wish I was a mole in the ground. I wish I was a mole in the ground. If I was a mole in the ground, I'd root that mountain down. And I wish I was a mole in the ground. And Tempe needs a $9 shawl. Yeah, Tempe needs a $9 shawl. When I come over the hill with a $40 bill, and it's honey, where you been so long? I've been on the bend so long. I've been on the bend so long. I've been on the bend with a rough and rowdy men, and it's honey, where you been so long? And I don't like the railroad man. I don't like the railroad man. That railroad man, he'll kill you if he can, and he'll drink up your blood like wine. And I wish I was in the spring. I wish I was a lizard in the spring. If I was a lizard in the spring, spring I'd hear my darling sing. I wish I was a lizard in the spring. And it's Tempe, let your hair hang down. Yeah, Tempe, let your hair hang down. Let your hair hang down and your bangs curl around. Tempe, let your hair hang down. And I wish I was a mole in the ground. I wish I was a mole in the ground. If I was a mole in the ground, I'd root that mountain down. And I wish I was a mole in the ground. So yeah, basically this talk is about why somebody like me, a Jewish kid from the urban Northeast, would sing something like that or want to sing something like that. And first, I want to put a little bit of context. First of all, Dave Van Ronk. Some of you may not recognize him without his beard, but that is Dave Van Ronk in 1960. He was my friend and mentor, not just as a musician, but as a writer. He's the one who gave me books of who I should study once I decided I wanted to write. Philosophically, politically, I mean, what I know I learned from Dave. And so this is going to be a Van Ronk-centric view of the world, and that's how it is. All of my books, incidentally, including How the Beatles Destroyed Rock and Roll, are a Van Ronk-centric view of the world, one way or another. Not that he would have agreed with me about anything, but that was the process. Now, in terms of context, that article was from the Village Voice. It was a cover piece from 1960. Between the founding of the Village Voice, around, I forget when it was, early 50s, and 1965, they ran a total of 2 stories on folk musicians. So in terms of Greenwich Village as the home of folk music, that's a bit of the context. The other one, incidentally, was Carolyn Hester 3 months earlier, and there was never another story until Bob Dylan at Newport. The other thing is, we often talk about musical roots, and that's a terrific metaphor that's always misused. People talk about musical roots, meaning what came before something else, but roots don't come before plants. Roots are what grow down as the rest of the plant is growing up, and that, in fact, is how we do history. So it is, in fact, a terrific metaphor, but it needs to be understood right. So, for example, when we look for the roots of Bob Dylan, which is frequently how, in fact, almost always how the people I'm going to be talking about here are framed, what you do is you start with Bob Dylan and work backwards. You don't look at what was there before he arrived, and of course what was there before he arrived was a world that did not imagine Bob Dylan, and most of which had no relevance for what became Bob Dylan. So, this is a concert, the New York Folk Singers Guild in 1958. The New York Folk Singers Guild was a group that, as Dave explained, it started as a musicians' union to protect them from being exploited by the filthy capitalists running the coffee houses. But seeing as how the filthy capitalists weren't hiring them, in fact, what they did was produce concerts. This is a concert with Dave Van Ronk, Gina Glazer, who is with us tonight, Robin Christensen, who unfortunately is no longer with us at all, but who married one of the Kasoy sisters. I just learned while researching this. I've loved this last week. I've been finding out all this stuff I didn't know. Ellen Kasoy goes, oh yeah, it's my husband. And I want to play you a little bit of a track from this concert. This is Gina Glazer with Robin Christensen on banjo.
As we marched down to Fenario, as we marched down to Fenario, our captain fell in love with a lady like a dove, and they called her
if we're going to think in terms of the roots of the 60s, there's a really fun story about that. Because I just, in the last week, researching this, I put Gina Glazer's name into Google. And what you come up with is Eric Clapton's autobiography, where he says one of his important early influences was Gina Glazer, the first American folk musician he ever met, who he followed around going to her shows and admired greatly, and specifically he mentions Pretty Peggy-O. I think it's important to think in this context. I mean, when they gave that concert in 1958, Eric Clapton was 13 years old, and the furthest possible thing from anybody's mind was that they were formative figures in what was about to be rock and roll superstars. On the contrary, the whole orientation was away from rock and roll, was away from pop music. And this was a world that was unknown except to a very small coterie of people who were very proud of the fact that they were discovering something genuine and something that the bigger world was unaware of. And just to give a little background, there had been a big folk music scene in Greenwich Village in the early 40s, or at least some very important people. Josh White, Richard Dyer Bennett, Susan Reed are all good examples. These people were consummate professionals. They were nightclub performers. They used traditional material, but they made no pretense on stage of being somebody from the sticks. Josh White, in fact, was somebody who had grown up in that world in the South leading blind blues musicians, but at Cafe Society, he was a sex symbol. He was the model for Harry Belafonte. And this world, this starts around 1940, and you can think of it as culminating with another nightclub group that got together specifically to be professional nightclub entertainers, then teamed up with a big band arranger, Gordon Jenkins, and got the #1 hit in the United States in 1950. And I always see the Weavers listed as part of the folk music world, but it's important to remember when they had the #1 hit in the United States, that wasn't just about folk music. There were top 10 hits of Goodnight Irene for the Weavers, Frank Sinatra, and Joe Stafford. Dave Van Ronk was 14 years old in 1950, and he was in Richmond Hill, Queens, singing as a member of the Harmoniotes. And his description of what they did, he says, "We had no lack of models. The Four Races, the Sons of the Pioneers, the Mills Brothers, and of course the Weavers, who were a big phenom right then. I didn't think of the Weavers as folk singers especially. They were just another pop group with interesting harmonies." The Village, of course, also produced the most popular folk singer of the 1950s. Harry Belafonte was an actor and singer who, with some friends, put together a restaurant where he performed in Greenwich Village, and that was how he got visible before he went on to Broadway. And I'm showing these things just because this is not the way we normally talk about folk music, because this is not exactly what gives us Bob Dylan. And what people thought of, most people in the United States, as folk singers in the mid-1950s were people with pretty voices, and specifically Harry Belafonte, who as late as the early 60s was still in polls of college students being listed as the favorite folk singer of American college students. #2 was Pete Seeger, #3 was Josh White, #4 was Bob Dylan. We're talking now 1964. And the change that happened in the 60s was largely due to something that happened in Greenwich Village and to some of the people I'm about to be talking about in a world that was very specific to the Village. And I'm not trying to avoid the Dylan thing and all that. I've mentioned his name a bunch of times. I'm going to stop now. But there's no way Dylan would have happened without this. But that wasn't what it was about, obviously. And the scene I'm talking about remained very local, and most of the people I'm going to be talking about today, except for those of you who were there, you've probably never even heard the names, which is part of what fascinates me about this. Now, first off, in the 1950s, the main folk venue in Greenwich Village, indeed in some ways in New York, was not a club. The main venue for folk music was Washington Square on Sunday afternoons.
This is the Circle. On weekdays, it's a wading pool for village kids. But on Sundays, the water is turned off and the Circle becomes a meeting place for guitarists, bongo and banjo players, villagers on a stroll, folk singers, and tourists. The Circle is a good place to meet old friends and make some new ones.
How many people recognize him? Bob Llewyn, right. No, not many people. I just was interested. Yes, absolutely, Bob Llewyn. We'll see pictures of Roger Sprung soon enough. So what was happening in the clubs at that point would typically have been something maybe like this, in the coffee houses.
Dig everything, as Poet Allen Ginsberg said. Dig me, pretty baby. You should learn everything you can in school, then come out and use it against them. You should visit a psychiatrist as often as you visit a dentist, once a year. You must love your life out. You must love your life out and live by loving every minute in it. And last, pretty babies, learn to say yes, yes, yes more often.
That's Ted Jones at the Cafe Bazaar. And there's a connection between those two scenes that's sort of interesting. Because in the mid-50s, musicians would gather in Washington Square, and then this is now, I'm quoting Van Ronk, remembering when he first showed up there, which would have been around 1955, 54, 55. He said, there would be 6 or 7 different groups of musicians, most of them over near the Arch and the Fountain. The Zionists were the most visible because they had to stake out a large enough area for the dancers. And they'd be over by Sullivan Street side of the square singing Hava Nagila. Then there'd be the Labor Youth League kids. Someone like Jerry Silverman would be playing guitar, surrounded by all these kids who had learned union songs in progressive summer camps and from Sing Out magazine. Sometimes there'd be 100 or 200 people all singing Hold the Fort or We Shall Not Be Moved. And there were people there who knew how to sing harmony, so it actually could sound pretty good. The Bluegrassers would be off in another area, led by Roger Sprung, the original City Billy. And then there were various people singing ballads and blues, and we would split into a number of smaller circles around whoever felt like singing. The singers varied over the years, but they might include me, Dick Rosmini, Barry Kornfeld, Luke Faust, Happy Traum, Gina Glazer, Roy Berkeley. But singing was only permitted in the square until 5 o'clock. After that, in some years, there was a series over at the American Youth Hostels on 8th Street, where people could go in the early evening. And then the inner circle would move over to 190 Spring Street, where there was an apartment building where the folklorist Roger Abrams and some other people had apartments. And the apartments would turn into this layered jam session that would last until people staggered home or passed out or whatever ended the jam session. And the landlord of that Spring Street building was a man named Rick Allman. And Rick Allman figured out that there was a lot of entertainment there that was fun, and maybe the people would work for free, or maybe if they made a little money, could pay their rent. And he opened a club called the Cafe Bazaar. He actually had the folk musicians help him do the building, build the stage, and so forth. And that's where you just saw Ted Jones. The Cafe Bazaar, as Dave remembered, he kind of hedged his bets. In concept and design, this is Dave, the Cafe Bazaar was a tourist trap, selling the squares of Greenwich Village that had never existed. The ambience was cut-rate Charles Adams' haunted house, dark and candlelit with fake cobwebs hanging all over everything. The waitresses were got up to look like Morticia, with fishnet stockings, long straight hair, and so much mascara that they looked like raccoons. But It was the first village coffee house that regularly featured folk music. And actually, the opening night, they headlined Odetta as a named star. And the opening acts were a bunch of people from the Washington Square and Spring Street world. Dave played, the only review I found mentioned Dave, Logan English, Bob Brill, Luke Faust, Ellen Adler. Dave thinks that Roger Abrams, Roy Berkeley, and Judy Isquith were also there. These are not household names, but this was that world, and I want to just play a taste of Ellen Adler, a name that may not be familiar.
She's a pretty bird. She sings as she flies. She brings us glad tidings, and she tells us no lies. She sucks all the pretty flowers that make her voice clear, and she never says cuckoo. 'Twas the spring of the year.
That was recorded in 1958. Ellen Adler didn't stick with this. She married Luke Faust, who I've mentioned a couple of times, but then she moved out to California, renamed herself Shekinah Mountain Water, and I did not make that up, and became one of the founders of the goddess spirituality movement. One of the things that's hard about understanding this period is that there were a lot of people involved who were very sincere, dedicated, cared about their music, about their politics, about their spirituality, about all sorts of things, more than they cared about, or in fact did not care about and did not approve of, wanting to make it in the music business. But there was also MacDougal Street, the people running the clubs, the people opening the coffee houses, who were very much into the commercial side of it. I have to show you another Café Bizarre picture. This is so wonderful. I mean, this is completely shuck for the tourists. And it's no accident that the Café Bizarre would go on to be the place where Andy Warhol first met the Velvet Underground. I mean, this was Hustler Central in a way. It's also not a surprise to me, though in another way a huge surprise, to find that the Café Wa, another explicit tourist trap, was run by a guy named Manny Roth. I had not made the connection. He's the uncle of David Lee Roth of Van Halen. And there's a wonderful video on the internet of David Lee Roth telling the story of the Café Wa, which is wonderful for many reasons, among them that David Lee Roth by now sounds like an old Jewish New York guy. Oh yeah, Manny, it's really great. The coffee houses were economically a mixed bag. They didn't have liquor licenses, which made it hard to make a lot of money, but on the other hand, because they didn't have liquor licenses, they could run all night, so that once the bars closed, all the tourists, everybody else had to go to the coffee houses, and also they didn't have as much problem with the cabaret licensing laws. So they really came out of that economic possibility, and they were designed largely, particularly places like the Bazaar and the Café Wa, to cater to the tourists. And there was a huge tourist scene. This is something that Dave talked about all the time, and everyone who was there talks about, but that you never read in histories of the folk revival, how much of the audience in this world were the Gray Line tour bus people in from Omaha wanting to see the Beatniks and Weirdos. I mean, they'd seen Dobie Gillis, they'd seen Peter Gunn, they'd seen Bell Book and Candle, and goddammit, they wanted to see a weird beat poet. And now, Van Ronk always argued that that was one of the things that made the village such a great training ground, because the coffee houses stayed open all night, which meant that if the crowd stayed out, you could be doing 5, 6 shows a night. The audiences were horrible, and so you were going through a very tough school very fast. And as he said, you know, his generation probably spent as much time on stage working audiences in the first year or two that they were playing as people of my generation will spend in our whole lives. And as he says, you know, it's not an accident that people became good performers. It was that or die. In this early period, the entertainment was typically a mix, meaning early period 57, 58, of folk singers and beat poets or pseudo-beat poets. This is the one album put out by the Gaslight Cafe. Hugh Romney, better known today as Wavy Gravy, was a hip comedian and sort of poet, and the MC, John Brent, did sort of a Lord Buckley shtick. Len Chandler was a very, very good musician and one of the first important singer-songwriters to come out of this world. And that mix is very important because it was that mix of beat poetry and the folk music that then turns into or makes New York the place where that singer-songwriter world happened that came later with Len Chandler, Bob Dylan, Fred Neil, later on Joni Mitchell, Leonard Cohen, which was mixing the poetic aesthetic of the beats with the musical aesthetic of the folk musicians. And this was a meeting ground for that. But in this early period, there was also plenty of other stuff happening. First of all, the previous generation was still around, and there was a lot of international music. I fell in love with this picture when I was looking through the Elektra catalog and noticed that Cynthia Gooding sings Turkish and Spanish folk songs. That cover is by Maurice Sendak, so I had to show it to you. Van Ronk and his friends didn't play a lot of international music, but they were certainly aware of it. This is the cover of Caravan magazine, which included a review by Blind Rafferty, who was Van Ronk being nasty about Elektra Records and therefore using a pseudonym, but specifically reviewing a record of Haitian music. And they also reviewed records of all sorts of international stuff. That was very much part of the folk scene in that moment. And till the end of his life, Dave enjoyed singing. He would sing along with the Philippe Kutev Bulgarian Ensemble with the women's chorus. This is a picture of him with Lee Hoffman, who was the editor of Caravan in Washington Square, and he's playing a banjo. He remembered, this is again Dave, we were a small enough group of people that the bluegrass players knew the flamenco players, the flamenco guitarists knew the blues singers knew the ballad scholars, we all knew the Irish musicians, and there was a great deal of cross-pollination. For example, he says, I learned parts from John Dowland's Airs for Four Voices, just because people were singing that kind of stuff. It was interesting. He said, we were all hanging out together, and if you were any kind of musician, you couldn't find enough hands to pick all the pockets. As an example, here's a little bit of Dave singing a Bahamian lullaby that a lot of us know from Joan Baez, but this is before Joan Baez recorded. This was 1957.
There is a tree in paradise, the Christians call it the tree of life. Oh, my triumph soon will be over.
Not the sort of material we're used to hearing him sing, but it may be worth mentioning his one big copyright was the song Bamboo. Take a stick of bamboo, throw it in the water. That was compiled by Van Ronk. And to get a sense of the scene, I just want to show you a couple of quick pages from the Village Voice nightclub ads. This one is from 1962. This is after the folk scene has really started happening. You have Mike Seeger and Hetty West at Folk City. But the show I would have been at is down there at the Village Gate, a triple bill of the Thelonious Monk Quartet, the Coleman Hawkins Quartet, and the Eric Dolphy Quartet. The bitter end has Juan Serrano, a flamenco guitarist, and in tiny letters, Len Chandler opening. And down there at the Gaslight Cafe, you have Hugh Romney still, the Hal Waters Trio, which was sort of a pop folk jazz group, the Dolphins, Near Eastern musicians, Juan Moreno, another flamenco guitarist. I'm trying to do a tie-in with the flamenco exhibit here, but I didn't even know it was here till I got here. This is purely accidental. And sandwiched in the middle, Tom Paxton, American balladeer. So when we look back at this as where people like Tom Paxton were playing, it's worth remembering he's playing along with the Near Eastern musicians, along with the flamenco guitarists. And I also just want to mention those John Dowland songs that Dave mentioned. Well, let me show you actually the next slide, because I think it's worth thinking about the fact that this is the same period and the same place where the early music revival was happening. And there's a lot of shared philosophy. This idea of going for something more genuine, older, and trying to do it right, not just play Bach on a piano, but actually rebuild Renaissance harpsichords and play it the way it would have been played in Bach's time. And that's really very core part of the aesthetic of the people I'm talking about today, this idea of trying to do it right. And in fact, the one album of a group called the Washington Square Folk Singers, assembled from the regulars there, includes Sandy Bull playing a selection of John Dowland airs on banjo. I'm not making up this overlap. But also check out the band that's headlining Folk City. This is a group that is absolutely key, not just musically. The guy in the middle there is Roger Sprung. And he not only was the first guy to bring bluegrass to the city, he was the first guy ever to record a bluegrass banjo piece on an LP. Back in the early 50s, people like Bill Monroe and Flatt and Scruggs were just recording for the jukeboxes. But there was this American Folk Say series, and it included a trio with Roger Sprung. Sorry, my mind goes blank easily. With Roger Sprung, Eric Darling, sure, and Bob Carey, who shortly replaced Sprung with Alan Arkin, became the Tarriers and had two of the biggest hits of the 1950s, Cindy Oh Cindy and the Banana Boat song. But this is a song that Sprung recorded with them back in 1953, that first bluegrass banjo solo, and it's a song that you may recognize this arrangement because it was stolen very shortly.
Hang down your head, Tom, to the lead. Hang down your head and cry. Hang down your head, Tom, to the lead. Oh boy, you're bound to die.
But there's the Scruggs picking. I wish the Kingston Trio had had that banjo player, but they didn't. The other guys there are also important. The fellow playing the washtub bass, he called it a brownie bass, is Lionel Kilberg, a central figure because he's the guy who actually went down to City Hall every month and got the permit for the singing in Washington Square Park, and therefore also had to be there because the permit holder had to be present. So he was in Washington Square every week. The fellow on the other side is Mike Coen. He was working at the American Youth Hostels and started doing the concert program there, which may be the first regular folk concert program in New York. I'm not sure of that. That was taken over a little while later by Barry Kornfeld, who is here tonight. This is a schedule from 1958, and you notice the Shanty Boys are still opening every month. Barry's there. Mike is there with his younger brother, John Coen. Dave. Down at the bottom, Tom Paley, who would shortly get together with John Coen and Mike Seeger and start the New Lost City Ramblers. These people were not professional musicians. I was just talking with Mike Coen last week. He said he started going down as a student, then he kept going down to Washington Square and playing while he was in the Army for a couple of years, and then when he became a teacher. Tom Paley, who was an unbelievably old, 30 years old at this point, was a math teacher. But they were serious about their music. They were extremely serious about their music. I mean, just compare that picture with that picture. And that's a huge difference. I think the early music analogy, at least, is good if it isn't direct influence. Their point was they were not just trying to play old folk songs, which is what the previous generation had done. They were trying to play them in the authentic styles of the people who had played them in the South or who had played them in the past. And Van Ronk actually coined the term neo-ethnics for himself and for this crowd. And I don't want to, there's a very strict line between this and the previous generation, but I don't mean by that to say that people didn't overlap, because in fact one of the seminal albums of the neo-ethnic revival was in fact by Pete, or in this case still Peter Seeger. This album was a real attempt to play old-time mountain banjo and to sing in old styles, and it was extremely influential on a lot of people, like, for example, Tom Paley, who, incidentally, I couldn't find a good copy of this, but thank God I'm giving a talk at Lincoln Center. We just went down to the basement, and they have this incredible record library. So we just pulled the damn thing off the shelf and scanned it. It's a beautiful world. And I want to just play a tiny bit of this, because this is a little different than what we've heard before. This is not trying to be a kind of pretty music, nightclub music, pop music. This is trying to sound right.
Oh, where is little Maggie? Over yonder she stands, with a rifle on her shoulder and a 6-shooter in her hand.
Incidentally, almost this whole album he plays banjo, but I'm a guitar player, and I owe everything to Tom Paley. I mean, Dave Van Ronk started coming down to Washington Square. He was a jazz snob. He wanted nothing to do with all those LYLers singing the summer camp songs. But he heard Tom Paley play guitar, and he said, damn it, you can play jazz if you can play like that. And, I mean, the extent to which Tom Paley's fingerstyle playing influenced everybody I care about. I had to pay tribute. Another extremely influential person who is not all that well remembered is Paul Clayton. Now, Paul Clayton was a pedigreed folklorist. He had done serious collecting in the South. He had made some terrific recordings of older musicians, but he was also an extremely prolific performer. He actually made 15 solo LPs between 1954 and 1959. The way Van Ronk told the story, and it seems pretty accurate, is that basically Clayton would go down to the New York Public Library, go through some old folk music books, say a lumberjack songs from Maine, and then go down to Mo Ash at Folkways Records and say, you know, Mo, I was just looking through the Folkways catalog. Do you know you don't have a single album of lumberjack songs from Maine? And Mo would say, gee, I suppose we really should have something like that. Do you know anyone who could do an album like that? Clayton at times also muddied the waters, though, between folklore and songwriting. He was a professional performer. And I'm going to play a little bit of a song that he kind of compiled from some verses he'd found in older stuff. But he put it together this way, and it's of some interest because it was rewritten yet again a few years later.
So it ain't no use to sit and sigh now, darling, and it ain't no use to sit and cry now. It ain't no use to sit and wonder why, darling. Just wonder who's gonna buy you ribbons when I'm gone. So I'm walking down that long, lonesome road.
Isn't that wonderful? That's not typical Clayton. More typical of Clayton would be an album like this one. He was from New Bedford. His ancestors had been sailing men.
Oh, come all you sailors bold, and when my tale is told, oh, I know that you all will pity me. For I was a bloomin' fool in the port of Liverpool, on the time when I was first paid off from sea. Oh, it's Maggie, Maggie May, they have taken you away to toil upon Van Diemen's cruel shore. 'Cause you robbed many a whaler and many a drunken sailor, and now you'll never cruise round Liverpool anymore. I was
That high, sort of annoying voice there.
And £2.10 a month had been my pay.
Yeah.
As I jingled my tin, I was sadly taken in.
Again, this whole world is cross-pollinating. I have to play that chorus a little louder so you can hear him properly. I love this harmony.
For you robbed many a whaler and many a drunken sailor, now you'll never cruise round Liverpool anymore. Oh, when I steered into her, well,
Now, Dave, as it happens, had actually been in the Merchant Marine. He loved this kind of stuff. He actually led one of the songs on the album.
All on the bowl and homeward we are going.
all on the bowling,
All on the bowling beat.
And that's not pop folk. That's a serious attempt to put together a record that really sounds like how sailors sounded. The banjo player, incidentally, on Maggie May was the guy we saw back in Washington Square, Bob Llewyn. This is Dave Van Ronk, Bob Llewyn, and Roy Berkeley at the Folklore Center on MacDougal Street. What they're doing would have sounded like this. This, as far as I know, is the three of them, though. If somebody wants to tell me I'm wrong, tell me afterwards.
Oh, my mind's in a dither, my mind's in a whirl. My mind's in a dither, my mind's in a whirl. All because you're a double-crossing girl. Fix me a pallet down by your floor. Fix me a pallet down by your floor. Fix me a pallet down by your door. Well, that was pretty bad.
Yeah. Well, that was pretty bad, as Roy is saying at the end. And, you know, this wasn't a professional recording. This was a casual jam session that happened to end up on tape. And that was a big part of this scene, was simply people playing for each other. There wasn't a big professional world. And the place that they're playing also matters. That's the Folklore Center, which Izzy Young opened on MacDougal Street in 1957. This is a plug for the new book of Izzy's writings. That's the Folklore Center. Behind it, the Gaslight Cafe, the Kettle of Fish Bar, the classic haunts. He wasn't a singer or a musician. Izzy had actually got in via folk dancing, another bit of the cross-pollination. He was a Morris dancer and would put on his bells and harness and dance down MacDougal Street now and then. But he put together this place that had probably the largest collection of folklore books, probably on the planet, of any store. And also records and guitar picks and strings and all of that sort of thing. He also began putting on concerts. This is actually one of the first he produced, Tom Paley and Paul Clayton. This was in 1957. He later got a bar to agree to let him do concerts there regularly. That evolved into Folk City after they got rid of Izzy and took it over themselves. But more importantly, his store really provided all this folk world with a central gathering place. Whatever your tastes were, the Folklore Center was a place where you could go, you could find stuff relevant to it, and you ran into other people. If you read Bob Dylan's Chronicles, he met Dave because he showed up on MacDougal Street, saw this place, had to go into it, and then Dave Van Ronk wandered in, and that's how that starts. And this picture is from a little later, but it's another person I want to mention in another part of this scene. The fellow down next to Izzy is Sam Charters. He was Dave's roommate for a while. He was a jazz player. He played a little bit of trumpet. They had jug bands now and then. But he also was the guy who really invented modern blues scholarship. He not only listened to old records, but he went down south, looked for the old guys, interviewed them, went through old newspapers, and wrote a book called The Country Blues with a record that went with it. And pretty soon, other people were inspired by him to go down south, and that's why we got to hear Mississippi John Hurt again, Skip James, Son House, all of these people. Sam was the one who had the vision to say, this is not just stuff on old records. These people are down there. We can still go down and find them and hear them and see them again live. I would love to follow that tangent some more, but I need to jump to another record. This started the world where you're reissuing those old records, because that also was something new. Alan Lomax had done a little bit, but there was this 6-record, 6-LP set in 3 separate boxes put together by a beatnik, filmmaker, eccentric village character named Harry Smith, who had this terrific record collection of rural music from the South from the 1920s. And he put out these things. Van Ronk recalled, as he says, you know, the anthology had 82 cuts on it, and after a while, we all knew every word of every song, including the songs we hated. The anthology provided us, though, with a classical education that we all shared in common, whatever our personal differences. And it was not just a matter of repertoire. This was what gave people a chance to actually hear models of what the real way to play this stuff would be. And people assiduously learned stuff off this. My version of I Wish I Was a Mole in the Ground is off the Bascom Lamar Lunsford version, off the American folk music collection there. And Van Ronk recalled that most of his crowd were trying to play this. He says, you know, at the beginning, very few people actually did it very well. He says a lot of the time we sounded like we were trying too hard, trying to compensate for our inadequacies with volume and enthusiasm. And he says the one person who he felt really got it in this period was Luke Faust. He says he was a much quieter, more subtle musician, didn't try so hard. I don't even have a picture of Luke from this period, or rather I may, you can tell me later on. But he does, this is Luke Faust doing a song that Doc Boggs had recorded back in the 20s and that was on the anthology. Yeah.
Got no sugar baby now, oh Lord, got no sugar baby now. I ain't got no use for your red rocking chair. I ain't got no honey baby now, Lord, Lord, ain't got no honey baby now.
Sorry, I'd love to play more of that. I love the sound of that. Now, I'm not saying that the neo-ethnics were the only people who were buying this. I mean, there were some very pretty singers who also picked up a lot of the stuff. I want to play you a little bit of the Casoy Sisters. How many of you recognize that name? Okay, you've all heard them, because the Coen Brothers, God bless them, they're the ones who are the voice of the sirens in the lake scene that was for the Oh Brother, Where Art Thou soundtrack was re-recorded by Emmylou Harris and Dolly Parton, but what you hear on the soundtrack is the Casoys. And they're still very much around. Yeah, let me get that. This again is a song off the anthology.
Hard is the fortune of all womankind. They're always controlled. They're always confined. Controlled by their parents until they are wives. Then slaves to their husbands the rest of their lives.
For anyone who thinks feminism began in 1970, I give you the Casoy Sisters. They're playing for Woody Guthrie, and it's important to mention, you know, one of the things that was really different for this generation and then for mine, and that I envy them, is that I had all the old records. I had more old records than these people could possibly have dreamed of ever getting their hands on. But they also had a lot of the actual people. And one of the differences that makes is that the people, if you're trying to get the sound off the records, all you can do is try to imitate it exactly. But if you've got the people standing right next to you saying, no, 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 that sounds nice the way you're doing it, you realize that you can do your own things with it and that you don't have to be doing this absolute imitation. And there were a lot of the older people around still. Woody Guthrie wasn't playing anymore, but he was coming down to Washington Square. He was somebody who, you know, he was in the world. And there were people around who really were playing. Reverend Gary Davis. I just saw, there's a new documentary which I highly recommend on Gary Davis that includes some amazing footage of him at the Newport Folk Festival evening concert. I mean, he's a phenomenal performer and one of the greatest guitarists ever to walk the surface of the earth. He also was a guitar teacher, and he taught, you know, I've said what I said about Tom Paley, but I mean, for the virtuosos, this was the model for everybody. He played at a whole different level. I want to play a tiny bit of a Dave Van Ronk example. This is an example of something that Dave knew as a jazz guy, but that after hearing Gary, he realized, wait a minute, you can play this sort of stuff on guitar and put those things together.
Bolden say, funky butt, take it away, funky butt, take it away. Well, now I thought I heard him say, thought I heard Frankie do's and shout, open up the window, let the bad air out.
God, I just want to play these things through. I have to mention somebody else who was from that world. He was one of the best guitarists on that scene. There were a few people who were already terrific guitarists in the mid-50s, 56, 57. Barry Kornfeld, who's here. Dave was beginning to get it. Fred Gerlach, Dick Rosmini, and a young guy who was a huge personal influence on me in later years, Perry Letterman. And I want to just play a tiny bit of Perry playing something in Gary Davis's style. Have to do it. I loved Perry and he taught me so much. Terrific musician. We made one CD from his old tapes just after he died. I have a few copies outside and they're more online from his wife's website. And I need to mention Barry Kornfeld, though Barry may disagree about that. He was actually the person who, as Dave at least remembered it, brought Davis down frequently to Washington Square, and he played banjo together with him. I wish they'd recorded together. I would love to hear what that combination sounded like. And I have to play one Barry Kornfeld track, which is in a sense unforgivable, but this is the most perfect time capsule of this moment I found. I ran into this last week and just fell in love, because it shows something that I think, you know, the Coen Brothers movie, the few of us who saw it, our one negative comment, I really enjoyed the movie, was it's very dark, and everybody who was around in this time remembers it as being fun. And I haven't been playing a lot of funny music. I wanted to play this one object. This is sort of an Oedipal moment relative to the old guard. Pete Seeger had adapted this Uncle Dave Macon piece called The Cumberland Mountain Bear Chase into this story about this boy who's lost in the woods, and he just blowing his little horn, and all the sounds, the horses, the bear, the horn, Pete played on the banjo. And as Barry introduced this thing at a concert where he played it in 1958, somehow the song got over to Russia. and got reshaped into the Ural Mountain Wolf Chase. And I have to play this for you.
Once there was a little boy who wanted to go hunting wolves with his father. His father saying, "No, you are too young." This little boy saying, "All right, maybe next year." Is next year coming around, his little boy saying to father, "Father, I want to go hunting wolves with you." His father saying, "Well, I don't know, you might get lost out on the tundra and freeze to death." His little boy saying, "No, I will take along my little balalaika and play a tune to call for Old Ivan, and Old Ivan will come calling for me." So off they went. They got farther and farther away. Until there he was, all alone, all by himself on the tundra. So he took out his little balalaika and he played a tune to call for Old Ivan. It was the Ukraine. But all he heard was the sound of ice cracking. So he called again. That old ice cracking. All of a sudden, way off in the distance, he could hear them now. They were coming his way. The wolves are chasing Papa. The wolves howl in minor. I think they have all Papa to read. Listen to him bang. And they all froze to death.
I did check on the internet. You can't find the Ural Mountain Wolf Chase in Google. You are probably the first people to hear that damn thing since 1959. Boy, that makes me happy. I'm kind of finished, but I want to wrap up a few loose ends. First of all, obviously, I should have probably said something more about politics and protest music. I give you a cartoon from Sing Out magazine in 1962. Dave mentioned the Labor Youth League kids. That would have been, the Labor Youth League was the youth branch of the official Communist Party. They were the ones who were singing the Union songs in his memory when he first came to Washington Square. Dave and his friends were part of a new generation who wanted nothing to do with the CP, but that doesn't mean that they weren't radicals. I mean, Dave himself was a member at various times of the IWW, of the Libertarian League. At that time, as he says, at that time libertarians were anarchists, as his quote is, the mean-spirited reactionary assholes who are currently dragging that word through the mud had not yet appeared. And of various Trotskyist groups, actually he and Roy Berkeley, who we briefly saw. Roy used to occasionally bill himself as the traveling Trotskyist troubadour, and that was part of the basis of their friendship. They didn't, though, sing a lot of political music. Van Ronk's position was, you know, if you're a left-wing cabinet maker, does that mean you have to make left-wing cabinets? You know, he felt what he did well was play the best music he knew as well as possible, and he had his politics. And he would play benefits, and he would do what he could do to advance the cause of the working class, which, frankly, it's a little hard to see how it's necessarily advanced by someone in a coffee house singing Union songs. But they did do songs of protest, apparently. None of the names on that list, Roger Abrams misspelled, Roy Berkeley, Luke Faust, Gina Glazer, I don't know who Buddy Stevens was, Dave Van Ronk, Bob Yellen, These are not people who principally did that. But clearly that was part of that scene. I should have talked more about the New Lost City Ramblers, who were the first group to really break out of this world and to attract a lot of attention. In 1960, the second Newport Folk Festival happened right near here. It was the biggest event in folk music, biggest folk music concert ever done in the United States. And the New Lost City Ramblers were the only Greenwich Village act invited. Everybody else were people from the old guard, people from down south. They had already reached that new point where they also were being invited to play at Alan Lomax's shows at Carnegie Hall. I'm going to give you just a tiny sample of a New Lost City Ramblers thing that nobody has heard recently. The song is Battleship of Maine, but I'm going to play a little of their introduction. This is one of the very first New Lost City Rambler concerts.
You know, the name of our group is the New Lost City Ramblers. Now, for this program this week, we've done a lot of rehearsing in Baltimore and Washington and different houses like that. Every place we've gone, we've kind of gotten kicked out because we've been making so much noise so late at night. So we're thinking maybe of changing the name to the New Lost City Lease Breakers. But then there was some other possibilities.
Yes. There was a possibility of a trip to the Cotton Belt, for which we would have renamed ourselves the Weevil Brothers, Bill, Bowl, and Bull, or as better known to the public as See No, Hear No, and Speak No. Weevil. Well, the first time we rehearsed a joke.
We play corn and we speak it.
Play corn and we speak it.
But we don't drink it. This song we're going to do now is one that we just learned from Caravan magazine. It's written in there. Have good songs like this, and I tell you.
It's called The Battleship of Maine. You see, this is a kind of historical song because, as you can figure out from listening to it after a little while, it does deal with the period of the Spanish-American War and the sinking of the Battleship of Maine and the Rough Riders. So,
if you listen close enough, you can hear the fiddle sinking here.
You know, I'm just going to cut them off before they start playing. Every single New Lost City Ramblers concert I ever saw, they spent so much time talking and tuning. They occasionally would play a song. The songs were terrific, and you can hear the songs on their records. But they influenced everybody in a small world that became a bigger world. This is actually, Caravan magazine became the New Lost City Rambler Appreciators. They put out these badges. You notice the back says, "I am lost, please return me to 1932." And a generation wanted to be there. This from mid-60s is the New York Ramblers. Jody Stecker, David Grisman, Winnie Winston, Gene Lowinger, who I actually don't know him, but I sure know all the others on that list. And I want to put in a plug here because there's a scene still going on in New York that people who like this kind of music, if you're not aware of it, you should be aware of. Down at the Jalopy Theater in Red Hook. And Eli Smith, who's here today, puts on the Brooklyn Folk Festival, which is happening this 19th, 20th, and 21st of April. I'm actually playing there with my wife Sandrine on clarinet. Eli's group, which includes John Coen of the New Lost City Ramblers, is going to be playing Peter Stamfel, who some of you may remember, is going to be playing of the Holy Modal Rounders, the Fugs, the Bottle Caps, and now the Ether Frolic Mob. Peter Stamfel made my year a couple of years ago by calling me up in Boston and asking me to come down to New York and play guitar on a gig for him. I said, "Peter, have you ever heard me play guitar?" He said, "No, but I'm sure you'll be fine." I love him. And obviously, some people would probably like if I had continued this story into the 60s, but I wanted to give the part of the story that people aren't familiar with. The big change, this huge change happened. The way Dave described it is, here were all these people in 1958, 59, working really hard on this music, trying to break into the coffee houses, trying to create repertoires, and then the scene that they were waiting to have hit, and virtually none of them were on the scene even 2 years later. By 1962, virtually nobody I'm talking about here was playing on the folk scene. And Dave says, you know, people just came in from all over the country. And he says it's not so much that they were more talented. It's not that the best people from all over the country were coming in and the village people couldn't compete. It was that the village people, you know, they were students, they were people working as teachers, and they graduated, they had degrees, they could do other things. And he says, you know, this is a hard business. And as Dave used to say, you know, I once asked Dave, what does it take? You know, I wanted to be a professional musician. I said, you know, what does it take to become a professional folk musician? He said, what it takes to become a professional folk musician is not to have any other option. Because if you have another option, there will come a moment in your career when it will look better than this as a way of making a living. But all these people came in from all over the country who had no other options. They hitchhiked into town, they had to play the coffee houses. And as Dave says, it was simple economic determinism. By 1962, it was the whole new crowd. He made a short list, you know, Tom Paxton from Oklahoma, Len Chandler and Phil Oakes from Ohio, Carolyn Hester from Texas, Patrick Skye from Georgia, Mark Spolster from California, Judy Roderick from Colorado, Ian and Sylvia from Canada, Dylan from Minnesota, and so on. And he says, you know, it's not that Phil Oakes was a better performer than Roy Berkeley when he first arrived, he just needed it more. And Dave says, I was one of the few New Yorkers to stick it out, and that was because I was stuck with it. I didn't have money from my parents, I didn't have a degree, and there were any number of times when I would have gotten out of this dumb business if there had been any viable alternatives. But they weren't, and in the end, I'm glad things worked out like they did. And I'm going to end there. But I'm going to play one more song that I and pretty much everyone else who knows it learned from Dave. But it comes from that overlap between the beat poets and the folk singers. There was a beat poet named Bob Kaufman, actually one of the best people who was actually working those lousy tourist traps. And he was a black poet from New Orleans, and he remembered this children's song he had learned there as a kid and sang a few fragments of it to Len Chandler, and Len Chandler put it together into this, and then Van Ronk put together this guitar part. Said when I go by Baltimore, ain't no carpet on my floor. Come along and follow me, must go down to Galilee. Singing green, green, rocky road, promenading green. Tell me who you love, tell me who you love. And little Miss Jane, run to the wall now. Don't you stumble, don't you fall, don't you sing and don't you shout, but when I sing, come running out. Sing green, green, rocky road, promenading green. Tell me who you love, tell me who you love. And you see that crow up in the sky now. He don't walk, no, he just flies. He don't walk and he don't run, just keeps on flapping to the sun. And who Tooka, tooka, soda cracker. Does your mama chew tobacco? If your mama chews tobacco, hookah, tooka, soda cracker. Big green, green, rocky road, promenading green. Tell me who you love, tell me who you love. I'm going to do something unforgivable. I am going to take questions, but I'm going to play one more time capsule object. I had sworn I wasn't going to do this, and I should never do this after playing something pretty that was actually pleasant to listen to. But this is another object that most of you may never have run across, and that is directly relevant to this world because it is sort of a version of a song called the FFV, which was a train wreck ballad that was on the American Folk Music Collection by Harry Smith. And a fellow named Lawrence Block, who many of you may know as a mystery writer, took it into his head to write an appropriate version of this train wreck ballad for all of the people he knew in New York whose experience with trains was somewhat different. And he wrote this. Along came the IRT, a cannonballing through from 242nd Street to Flatbush Avenue. At 5:15 one Friday Eve, it pulled into Times Square. The people filled the station, and Georgie, he was there. The people filled the station, 1,000,000 head or more. George used his elbows and his knees until he reached the door. But when he reached those portals, he could not stand the gap. The conductor closed the door on him and cut poor George in half. The train pulled out of Times Square, the fastest on the line. It took poor George's head along, but it left his body behind. Poor George, he died a hero's death, his martyrdom's plain to see. And the very last words that George he spoke were screw the IRT. So when you ride the IRT and you approach Times Square, incline your head a few degrees and say a solemn prayer. For his body it lies between the ties amidst the dust and dew, and his head it rides the IRT to Flatbush Avenue. Right then, so please, there are many people in this room who were actually there, which I wasn't. I would love to hear from other people. I would love to hear questions, which they may be able to answer better than I can. Yeah?
First of all, thank you. This is a long information. I wasn't even born during this era. And, you know, I feel, to be honest with you, I feel like I've been cheated out of the reception or the formulation, if you will, of folk music and how it's evolved through the years. And music in general. I mean, nowadays we're left with American type top idol and things of that nature.
Yeah, I see where you're going with this. You know, there are two answers to that. One of the answers to that is there are always people who are going back and looking for something deeper, something real, something older, something that relates them to the world around them, to their past, to their ancestors. The other part of it is, you know, when Dave and these guys showed up in 1950s, they were saying, oh my God, I wish we could have been here in 1935 when it was really great. You know, that's simply the way life is. There's something for many of us very attractive about the past. But most of what's attractive about the past is it's the past and we've forgotten how rotten it was actually living in it. The other point, which Dave always used to say, Dave would always say, you know, people ask me, what was it like back then? And he said, you know, I can give you a lot of different answers. But what I say and what you hear will be two different things. Because the real answer I am always giving is, of course it was better then. I could take a flight of stairs 3 at a time. Yeah?
Well, I heard a story. I would like to verify. I don't know if it's true or not, but they happened to have been browsing around the West Village and I was a Stonewall.
Yes, Dave was one of the very few people actually arrested in the Stonewall riot. Yeah. This is actually an interesting moment. This is the sort of thing drives historians crazy. Dave was one of the few people actually arrested in the Stonewall riot. Dave always claimed it was an accident. He always claimed he happened to be walking by, he lived in the neighborhood, he got caught up in that thing. Oscar Brand insists that they were drinking next door and that thing started going down, and Oscar said, you know, let's stay out of it. And Dave said, no, this is an important fight. You've got to get out there when people are fighting. I have no idea. But he was one of the few people arrested at the Stonewall. Yes?
I love the version of Green Rocky Road. I learned it from a guy named Daniel Count, who was one of Dave's students, and another one was Steve Katz, and they put the two of one on the form of the Blues Project. I know that's later on, but.
Yeah. You just mentioned Danny Kalp. That's a name that should be mentioned. The list of names that should be mentioned.
Danny lives in Brooklyn, just in case.
Yeah, Danny's very much still with us and playing terrifically. Yes. And singing better than ever. He's singing, I mean, Jesus Christ, Danny is turning.
And
yeah.
Steve is in Connecticut.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is not, you know, one of the fascinating things is that when that American folk music set came out in 1953, everybody said, oh my God, this ancient music, recorded in 1928. Rap has been around longer than that gap. And, you know, this is, it's really hard to understand sometimes, but, you know, this isn't, you know, not in this room. Everybody in this room knows this isn't ancient history. Half of the people here remember this clearly. I mean, what can I say? A lot of the very good musicians from this period are still very good musicians, including, God bless us, Oscar Brand, who still sounds terrific and is celebrating, I think, his 70th year on radio. Well, Happy is not, thank God, Oscar's age. No, there are many people of Happy Traum's generation still around sounding great.
So is Pete Seeger.
Pete Seeger, the voice is kind of shot by now, but he's still Pete goddamn Seeger. And the first time I saw him after the voice started to be shot, it was wonderful because I realized he'd been training us his entire life for when he lost his voice. I mean, he got up on stage, he hit the first note on the banjo, we all knew our parts. It was great. No, I'm not joking. I mean, it was great. It had the feel, everything was still there because we had all grown up training for the moment when Pete might not be able to lead us, and we knew our parts.
Do you know the Long Island Railroad song, I Forgot to Change at Jamaica?
No, I don't. Is there an actual song or just a title?
An actual song, and it goes
see.
This guy didn't change it to Jamaica. Of course, now you don't change it to Jamaica. But anyway, and he goes to all these strange places on Long Island that he normally didn't go to. And it's a great song. It's a match for your
See,
song.
I missed that one. I was hoping it was just a title. There was a whole world in the old days of jazz musicians of titles that didn't have songs. Dave's favorite was Take Back Your Heart, I Ordered Liver. Yeah.
I was wondering, how did you meet Dave?
I met Dave Van Ronk because I heard his record from the Newport Folk Festival, and then I saw that he was playing in town, and I was probably 12 years old, and I grabbed my mother and said, "You have to take me to this concert." And Dave remembered that concert forever because there were about 30 people in the room, and it was Jordan Hall, which holds like 800 or 900. But it was him and Patrick Skye, and it was a hell of a show. And I walked out of that, and I just wanted to get closer to Dave Van Ronk, and it wasn't hard. He was playing at Possum Coffee House for the weekends every couple of months, so I just made a pest of myself, and then got my 1 year of college at NYU because it was the college nearest to Dave Van Ronk, and took a year of lessons from him, and then he said, "Okay, I'm done with you," so I dropped out of college, and the rest is history. I don't want to keep people sitting here. I'm not going anywhere. I'll be out front. Please feel free to stick around. The one thing I'm going to ask is, can I take 5 more minutes right now before we kick people out? Okay, I want to just see whether some of you who were around in that can help me, because by pure chance, I just suddenly, yesterday, got an email saying that the University of North Carolina has digitized all of their all of the stuff from these pictures I've been showing you, which were taken by a group called Photo Sound Associates in 1958. Anybody know who that is? No?
Bob Yellen, maybe.
No, it's definitely not Bob Yellen. That's all I can tell for sure. I was hoping that was Luke Faust, but I gather not. Okay, anybody who wants to get back to me, I can send these on. Oh, perfect. I actually have a recording of their concert. Pat Foster and Doris Stone. Well, he is one of the few black performers I've seen this scene.
Tony Selleck.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. Okay. No? He's playing a 12-string. Oh, well. Is that's who?
Bob Yellen and he's yodeling.
That's Bob Yellen yodeling. No? No.
That's not how it works, is it?
No.
I obviously will consult with people later. No? Is that Pat Foster again? Okay, that's all I had to ID right now. So thank you all very much for coming down.